I'm Charlie Bright of Gold Derby, and I am joined by Alex Pritz, the director of The Territory, as part of our Meet the Experts film documentary panel. The first question I wanted to ask was, you filmed this, since you completed filming this, there was another election in Brazil. Bolsonaro is now out of power. Former President Lula is just sworn in the last couple of weeks. How hopeful are the Uru'e people with the new Lula administration that's just come into power?
Yeah, it's a huge shift. It's a tone shift across the country, I think. And it was one of our goals, really, that the film tracks the effects of the Bolsonaro administration on these frontline communities. And while it's not, an overtly political film, you see the effects of Bolsonaro's policies and of his political speech on these people and how that is converted into violence really quickly. And so you see his inauguration happen on January 1st, 2019. And it was always a goal of ours to get the film out in Brazil before people went to the polls again for this next election. And so thankfully, we were able to have a theatrical release in Brazil just 3 weeks before people went to the polls. And then just last weekend, as you said, Bolsonaro was sworn out of office. And Lula, a former steel worker, union organizer, is back in as president, and he's made a lot of promises to Indigenous people. He's started a new Ministry of Indigenous Affairs led by an Indigenous woman. There's a record number of Indigenous women in Congress now for the first time. And so we're really looking to the future and looking for ways that we can support the Uru'e in building something better for the next. Yeah.
What was their experience like with government prior to Bolsonaro? Because as friendly as they might have been, I have a feeling that was there still like a lot of roughness that maybe with a former president coming back into power that could have possibly made them apprehensive about this?
Yeah, it's naive to think that the problems that Indigenous people in Brazil face will go away with, a new administration. These are problems that they've been facing for generations, centuries, since the Portuguese first arrived as the original colonizers of Brazil. But, Lula's been president before, and we've seen deforestation levels decrease under his previous administrations. There are quite good laws on paper in Brazil in terms of environmental protection. The thing we really saw over the past 4 years of Bolsonaro was the stripping away of any enforcement mechanisms for those laws. So the environmental police, the people that would have been going out and supporting Indigenous people, patrolling the land, arresting invaders, imposing environmental fines on people, all of that has been gutted. And so it's now up to the Lula administration both to rebuild those various agencies and to try to shift the tone of the country and help these frontier communities that have felt really emboldened to go out and seize, protected lands. Those people need to be brought back into the fold and given other ways of developing, agriculture that doesn't require new trees to be cut down.
So you kind of touched on this a little bit in the movie, but I was wondering if you could go into a bit more detail about what role has religion and specifically evangelical Christianity played in the destruction of these indigenous areas, because I've read some reports about how that has been another bit of the driving force behind this.
That is a great question, and one I don't get asked often enough. Thank you, Charlie. The rise of the evangelical church in Brazil has been really sharp over the past couple decades, and we try to hint at it in several ways. It's apparent in the kind of iconography of a lot of people with, we've seen tractors that are bulldozing the Amazon with a big cross painted on them, and people are very visibly demonstrating that they see this as part of a long tradition of discovery. I think there's a doctrine of discovery that was put out by the Catholic Church. That's one of the things that a lot of Native and Indigenous groups in Brazil have been trying to fight against, this idea that land is somehow empty and blank until you come along and colonize it and bring the church into that land. And that's when it becomes a habitable place, a civilized place. And so the film definitely does touch on that. I think a lot of the ideas that drive these people into the forest and fuel the destruction of the rainforest were developed and refined in America as well. The idea of manifest destiny, the westward expansion and expropriation of native land here in the United States, and the ensuing violence against native groups and the genocide that really occurred here. That is a reference point for a lot of these people in Brazil. They look to America as a kind of ideological vanguard for their movement and their colonial project. And so manifest destiny, the divine right to the lands that these settlers feel they have, a lot of that is directly related to the colonial project here in America.
So, I feel like this is a very basic question, but I'm still curious. First of all, how did you manage to get in contact with the Urayawawa people, and how did you manage to gain their trust to just be able to be around them and film them?
Yeah, so for me, this project really began with Nadine, the activist who you mentioned in the film. I had read about her work, felt incredibly inspired by her. She is this badass 60-year-old woman fighting tooth and nail against these massive forces, receiving nearly weekly death threats for her work. Her children had to be under armed federal police escorts to and from school and in elementary school. It's had a huge impact on her family and her whole life, fighting for the rainforest and indigenous rights. And then reached out to her when we saw the Bolsonaro campaign beginning to heat up and gaining momentum and the violent rhetoric that was coming out of that campaign. And so I flew to Brazil with a one-way plane ticket and a bit of an idea of what we might find there, but really just wanted to meet her and be with her through this pivotal moment as Bolsonaro was coming into power. Nadine very quickly said, look, this story cannot be just about me. It needs to include the Uruau, the defenders of the largest intact forest that's left in this part of the Amazon, a group of 150 indigenous people that are protecting an area of rainforest that's 2.5 times the size of the state of Delaware. It's massive. You can see it from outer space as this dark green island of forest surrounded by, brown, denuded, deforested farmland. And so through Nadine and her, 40-year relationship with this community, I was able to enter, ask permission to explain the film that we were interested in embarking on. It was a long, patient process, I'll say. I can get more into it, but it took months and months of conversations before we really felt like we were ready to even start filming with the community in earnest. And then when COVID came, it moved from sort of participatory framework that we had set up with the community into a full-on co-production where I wasn't able to enter their territory anymore, and the indigenous community picks up cameras and assumes responsibility of filming the last chapter of their own story.
One of the other things I'm also curious about is when you hear the idea of indigenous people in a rainforest, all sorts of ideas can come to people's heads. I'm sure even people in the country of Brazil. What do you think is the most misunderstood aspect of Brazil's indigenous population, and specifically, if you know this, with the Brazilian people?
That's a great question too. Without speaking for indigenous people, I think it'd be great to hear Bitate's answer to this question. I can talk a little bit about either my own preconceived ideas that were really changed through the making of this film. One of the ideas actually, though, that Bolsonaro really put forward strongly and has embedded itself in a lot of Brazilian people's understanding of indigenous people is Bolsonaro uses this term iPhone Indians, meaning, it's a way to denigrate indigenous people and strip them of their identity. Meaning, if you engage with technology, if you have a cell phone, if you use an iPhone, you can no longer claim access to that your indigenous identity. And the flip side of that statement is, by Bolsonaro's definition, the only real indigenous people are isolated indigenous people living in the forest, and who aren't really engaging in the Brazilian political processes. And so that's a really harmful idea. And I was really inspired by the young people in our film, Bitate, Chai Surui, our indigenous executive producer, who's 25, and their outright refusal of this false binary. They say, we are technologically advanced, we are media savvy and politically sophisticated, and we're in touch with our traditional culture, and we're using these tools to defend our land and our people. And I just thought that was a really, really inspiring and bold stance that they were able to take.
Yeah, I mean, that last part of the movie, I was just like, wow, he knows what he's doing with that stuff and how to do that.
Yeah. So Bitate, the 19-year-old leader of this indigenous community, uses technology. He gets drones and GPS and walkie-talkies and brings them into his community to advance his indigenous group's ability to surveil their land and catch these invaders, and then use that video as evidence to bring to the public prosecutor's office and say, no, look, you said you didn't believe me. Here's proof that these people are on our lands. Now go do something about it. And we've been really inspired by the fact that Bitate now, actually, he's in New York with me right now. We're doing some screenings here, but he got permission from his professors to take some time off because he's the first member of the Uruguay to go to university. And he just finished his first semester exams, and he's studying journalism. So, the project that this film has been a part of is continuing, and we're really excited to see where they take it next.
Well, Alex, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on our panel in just a little bit.
See you soon. Thanks, Charlie.